Welcome to another broadcast from mindyourhealthcast.com. I call it a broadcast. It started out to be a broadcast, and it really is, although it's a YouTube video. It is a presentation of various subjects related to health, as I'm sure you've ascertained by now. Occasionally, in fact frequently, I get either feedback in terms of people that I know, patients coming in, responses to the YouTube and or the website, requesting certain subjects that we discuss. And so all the things that we say, we touch on here and there in the various presentations. However, occasionally we do take a particular subject and kind of zero in and elaborate. And so one of the recent suggestions was that we do a presentation on digestion. So I'm calling it Digestion, What Gets Inside Ya. I got that term from a professor of anatomy physiology one time when he was discussing the subject of digestion, and so that was his term, inside ya. And so it's true. You've always heard we are what we eat, but he said nope, that's not accurate. It's what we eat that gets inside ya that is what makes us what we are. And so we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about the subject of digestion, what's involved, and some of the issues that can occur as a result of poor digestion or no digestion, and how it relates to our health and our illnesses. So we'll start out first of all by kind of talking about the digestive tract. And I'm going to hold up a little drawing, which is basically the digestive system. Now, whenever we talk about systems, we're talking about a group of organs or tissues that tend to work together for some specific process. And so with digestion, we're going to be talking about all the different parts of the body that work together in the digestive process. And I kind of give you some insight into some of the problems related to digestion and how they're dealt with in terms of healing medicine. I really like to think in terms of health and healing as opposed to treating diseases. You know, the word disease means to not be at ease. And when things aren't working right, we're not at ease, and hence we have dis-ease. And medicine has taken it a step further, regular medicine, and they group a group of symptoms together and give that group of symptoms a name, and then they call that disease. Therefore, they can give it a code number, and it can go into insurance, and they can be reimbursed, or the patient, I guess for the patient, payment for what it is they're dealing with. Now, of course, I hope you know the disease is not something that attacks you. We are always hearing about people fighting this and battling that and so forth. And it's that entity, it's almost like we've been attacked by some demon or some strong force that we have to struggle against, we have to fight, we have to battle. We always hear people that are battling cancer or they're fighting cancer. And to me, cancer is a disturbance of the body and not something that has attacked us. We like to try, I guess, going back to the idea of the disease being caused by germs, and hence the germ theory of disease. Well, it doesn't quite work like that, and here and there along the way we've dropped out pieces of information, and at some point we're going to go into it in more detail. But right now we're going to give you some information about the digestive process that goes on in the body, because really that's where everything begins. Digestion is what gets things inside us that are necessary for us to build energy and to maintain our life and health. And if that doesn't work properly, already we're in trouble. Now, a lot of people just assume that whatever you put in your mouth somehow mysteriously gets inside our body. And being in your mouth is not being in your body. It's in a cavity in the front of our face that we put things into and chew them up into small pieces and swallow them and start a process. Now, I think what we don't tend to think about is that because it's in our mouth does not mean it's inside us. It could, in the whole process, get inside us before it's all done, but not necessarily just because we put it there. We think if we take a calcium pill with 1,000 milligrams of calcium, that we are getting 1,000 milligrams of calcium in our body, which is inaccurate. We can potentially get it in there if everything were to operate properly, and we somehow could get it across the intestinal wall inside our body. Then yes, we could get 1,000, but the chances are that only a small portion of that can get in, and it depends on the form of calcium for it. And I'm just using that as an example, that it depends on the form, but in many cases, maybe only 5 to 10% at most of what we put in our mouth of calcium could actually get inside our body. So, and the reason I keep saying this inside is because when you look at the digestive tract, it is actually a hollow tube, in a sense, that starts at our mouth and ends at the anal opening. This tube goes through it. Now, in topology, which is a type of mathematics that has to do with distortion, certain forms are all mathematically identical, even though they look to us to be totally different in shape. And topology is the branch of mathematics that deals with taking a particular shape and being able to deal with it in all of its various distorted forms. And as long as all those distorted forms have come from that shape, then they are all in the same class of objects. Now, interestingly, I don't know if you've thought of it or not, but if you take a donut, which is in mathematics a torus, it can be distorted into a lot of different configurations that all still are the donut, even though when we look at it, it looks different and we call it something different. For example, if you take a donut, and you have to use your visualization for this, if you take a donut, a round donut with a hole through it, and you begin to squeeze the material of it all down toward the hole, all into a clump on one side, what you then have is a clump with a handle on it, with the hole through the handle where you would insert your finger to lift the cup and to maneuver it. Now, all this material that's pushed into a cluster on one side, if you kind of shape it into a tubular shape like a cylinder, and you press down inside and hollow it out, you can transform, topologically, a donut into a coffee cup. So in topology mathematics, the coffee cup would be identical mathematically to the donut or the torus. Now, our body happens to be the same way. Now, you have to use your visualization again, but if you took this donut and you compressed it so that the hole in the middle is smaller, and then you stretch it until it's tall, and then you begin to mold it into the form of a human being, we still have that hole starting at the mouth, going all the way through the body and out to the other end. And so topologically, our body is the same as a torus that has been transformed or manipulated or maneuvered into another appearance, but it's still the same. So what that means is you can put something in your mouth, in the hole of the donut, and it'll come out the other end of the donut, and potentially nothing could happen the whole process, because it still would actually be outside of you. And that's what the professor of anatomy and physiology, that's what he meant by the fact that it's still not inside you, it's only in this tube going through you, and it may or may not be able at some point along the way to be processed into a form that can get inside us so that we can utilize whatever it is that we put there. And so if you take the digestive tract, I showed you the picture of the whole digestive tract, and you lengthen it out, you can make it look like just what I said, a tube running all the way from the mouth to the other end, and then the body is all around that. So as long as something is in this tube, it still is not inside us, and a lot of material that we put in never does get inside of us. It ends up going on through and out the other side. So keeping that in mind, that's the process. Somehow we have to get this food broken down and into a form whereby it can be absorbed into our body, and then it can get inside you. But until that happens, it won't happen. And so that's what the digestive process in that tube does. It prepares that food by breaking it down into such a way that we can get it inside of us. And if that doesn't work right, the digestive process, then we're in big trouble. So, if you keep that in mind as we're talking about what we're talking about, our big concern is how do we get the food into the right form that it can be transported inside of us, whereby we can make energy and we can sustain our health. Now, to me it's very interesting because for that to work right requires certain things. And so we also have to keep in mind that the digestive system, such as the way the body is made, is actually a third brain. Now, there are books written, and we talked about that at one time, the three brains. If you go back and look at one of my previous videos, you will see that we talked about the three brains that exist in the body. And why do we call them brains? Because, number one, they are connected by the brain into the body, but at the same time they have a feedback that goes back to the brain and the head. So those three brains, just very briefly, is the one in our cranium, the cranial vault, which we call the brain, which has all kinds of communication capabilities. And we have the heart, which is the second brain, because the heart likewise not only receives information from the brain, but it feeds back information also to the brain. And if you go back and watch that video, as I say, we went into that in more detail. So there is a feedback mechanism. However, it's possible to cut the nerves, which basically are from the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. If we cut those off from the heart will continue to beat. It will continue to circulate blood, and it will continue to manufacture neurotransmitters. Hence, by definition, that would be a brain. The third brain is the digestive tract. The digestive tract also is innervated by the brain, but at the same time, the digestive tract feeds back information to the brain. Hence, in many cases, we can have some neurological issues related to the gastric tract. Now, if the same thing is true of the gastric tract, it manufactures neurotransmitters. In fact, there's more serotonin produced in the gastric tract than there is in the brain. And if you were to cut the nerves coming from the brain to the gastric tract, it will continue to function on its own. If you put food in there, it's going to put it through the same digestive process and eliminate the byproducts, the same as if the brain were controlling it. So it can, in a sense, operate on its own. And I don't know if you ever thought about it, like with the heart, if you do a heart transplant, they cut those nerves off. Now it's possible the body ultimately can re-innervate the heart, but it still will beat even with not having this neurological connection to the brain. And the gastric tract, as I say, will do the same thing. And there's been books written on it called The Other Brain, or the second brain. The people who are big in the gastric tract refer to the gastric tract as the second brain, and the people, of course, in the cardiovascular specialty consider the heart as also a second brain. I say that in that order, it's the brain and the head, then the heart, and then the gastric tract, and those are the three brains. Now, the autonomic system, as I said, is a steering mechanism. It sends out impulses that can be generated by the thought processes, either consciously or unconsciously, and it receives information back. And that is important in terms of turning on, turning out off. And we know that when you are under high stress, for example, which is one of the problems that can be a big problem with digestion, is that the stress overactivates the sympathetic system and hence depresses the parasympathetic, also known as the vagus nerve, which innervates the gastric tract. And so those people are going to have maldigestion if they're depressing the parasympathetic and overactivating the sympathetic. So we need to keep that in mind if we want to have good digestion. You don't eat under stress, or else you've got a problem. The digestive system doesn't work right. Now also, I'm sure are aware of the fact that the digestive system's purpose is to ingest raw materials that go through a series of steps down through this tube and are broken down ultimately into individual materials that then are absorbed, if again the digestive system is working properly, into the body, and therefore can be used to give us energy and to rebuild the body as it wears out, and to activate the brain and nervous system, and all of the things that go on in the body require that we continuously supply the raw material by putting it in our mouth and breaking it down through a series of steps until what's left is eliminated out the other end. Now, if something isn't working right along this whole system, we can be in trouble. In other words, we can eat a lot of food, but we can get very little out of it, meaning we don't get the raw material we need to make energy, because the body has to generate it from some of those key factors that we can extract from the food we eat, and the body needs it to rebuild, it needs it for the immune functions of the body, and to carry information about the body, and so forth. So it's all integral. I guess that's the big thing we want to get at, is that the whole digestive system is a part of an integral system. So the stomach isn't by itself, and the small intestine isn't by itself, and the colon or large intestine is not by itself. They're all part of an integral system, which is one of those systems that go to make up the whole living being, and that it has to carry on its function properly for a lot of other things to function properly also. I don't know if it's making sense to you, but I think it's important. Now, there's some factors about the digestive system that I think are interesting, is that that certain nutrients are produced only if the bowel system, stomach system, mouth system all work well together. Now, the primary digestion takes place in the mouth, the stomach, and the small intestine. The colon or large intestine is where some final things take place with what's left over from all this other process, such as absorbing water and absorbing a lot of minerals and preparing the leftover to be expelled from the body and being absorbed back into nature, being broken down by bacterial forms, which is what bacterial forms do in nature. They break down material that needs to be disposed of. Otherwise, our whole world would become so contaminated that with all this putrefying material, that we'd all be poisoned just from the putrefaction alone. And in the colon, a lot of the putrefaction processes take place, and a lot of poisons can be generated in the colon. Hence, the importance of the colon emptying frequently this material. Once it's gotten into the colon, there's a lot of things take place to prepare it to be disposed of out of the body. If we don't have a working colon, i.e. if we have constipation, then a lot of poisons are generated, and in the health field, we refer to that as auto-intoxication. That means we're poisoning ourselves because some of those poisons that are made in the colon are extremely toxic. One being that protein that never was digested properly, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Those proteins that were not digested properly end up rotting in our system. If you take a piece of meat and you put it in a warm, dark place and you don't break it down, you know what's going to happen? It's going to putrefy. And when it putrefies, the other term which we hear occasionally is rot. And you've heard of people being poisoned by rotten meat. And the reason is that rotting protein, especially from meat, breaks down into something called ptomaines. And I'm sure you've heard of ptomaine poisoning. Our body creates ptomaines because I dare say hardly anyone breaks down all the protein that they ingest. And if you eat a large steak, it's not going to stay in the stomach long enough to be broken down and completed then in the small intestine. And if certain things don't happen in the stomach, then it can't be broken down in the small intestine, because each step or each phase of the digestive process has to do certain things to those proteins, or they cannot be absorbed as they should be, which is amino acids. So the digestion process has to turn protein, first of all, first step in the stomach, has to be broken down into peptides. Now, peptides are pieces of large protein molecules that have been sheared apart, which is what the digestive process does in the stomach. And when they're sheared apart, now instead of being a large protein molecule, they're broken down into fragments of that protein molecule, which are called peptides. And the process in the stomach that does that is the first step of protein digestion by an enzyme referred to as pepsin, And pepsin got its name from the idea that it's ultimately going to produce peptides. And then once it gets into the small intestine, if it was broken down into peptides in the stomach, then in the small intestine, there are other proteases that break the peptides down into individual amino acids. Those are what we need then to be transported across the barrier from the small intestine into the bloodstream to be utilized in the body to build hormones, to build enzymes, and to rebuild our structure. And if we can't get it broken down in the stomach, the first stage, then in the small intestine, those enzymes are not prepared to break down large protein molecules, and therefore, what happens? They begin to deteriorate. And when they deteriorate, then they basically rot. And when they rot, they form ptomaines. And I've mentioned before that the ptomaines are, the major ones are putrescine and cadaverine. And of course, ammonia is another big byproduct of that. So ammonia is extremely toxic in the body. And hence, we can be poisoned by our food. Now, sometimes when people have traveled and are into unusual places and have eaten protein that's already in the process of rotting, then it forms the ptomaines, and that's when people get ptomaine poisoning, which, if you get a very large dose of it, it can be fatal. Your body cannot denature it fast enough to keep from being poisoned to death. So it acts as a poison and can shut us down. So, okay, it's very important that each of these steps along the way work as they should. Now, normally, this whole gastric tract has a barrier, and that barrier is what is called the mucosa. And the mucosa is the part that has to do with coating the inside, so number one, things move smoothly, and number two, to protect those tissues from the direct contact of a lot of things that could be very disturbing to it and damage it. Actually, could damage the cells that line it. So there is within all of the various areas of the tubes of the body certain cells called goblet cells that produce mucus, and the mucus is to coat and protect. And so that there is this barrier, and embedded within that there is one of the beginning stages of the immune system, which is immunoglobulin A. And immunoglobulin A serves as first line of defense of things that we're either breathing in or eating into our body, and helps protect us, because then immunoglobulin A are immune factors that attach to something that is toxic and lock it up so that it cannot be a poison to us. And so it serves us a big purpose. Now that's, again, assuming that the environment is proper within the intestinal tract. So this mucosa is protective, and as I say, it kind of helps move things through easily from the time we swallow until the time it comes out the other end. Okay, then it's important then that we understand that if you go back to Chinese medicine, they have very good explanations of a lot of things, and they put it in terminology that, of course, would not be that which is conducive to be taken in or utilized by regular medicine, but very explanatory of what goes on. Now, we know, people who have studied Chinese medicine, that the stomach, pancreas, and spleen work together as a unit in the digestive process. In Chinese medicine, it is said that the spleen regulates not only the digestion and breaking down, but it also regulates the distribution of the energy that is released as a part of this process to distribute it throughout the whole body as a part of a communicative and also a energy system to tie everything together. So spleen regulates stomach, which is the related organ to spleen, and it also regulates a related gland, which happens to be the pancreas. Now, we've mentioned before, and I don't know if you caught it or not. I mean, sometimes we throw out a lot of stuff and sometimes it doesn't click. If we're busy thinking about one thing that was said, we many times miss the other. Now, I think I mentioned before that many years ago I took a program. It was called A Course in Listening. And part of the problem, anytime we're listening to somebody tell us information, is that the brain is always operating about 4 times as fast as the speech is. Okay, so while they're talking to you, giving you this information, the brain is going zing, 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 while we're going, yeah. And so, therefore, we may get hung up on the words which are coming out only 1/4 as fast as the brain, and so the brain, to keep itself busy, is shooting off other directions or analyzing something that was said, one portion of it, and 3/4 of that information goes right by us. It doesn't register. And so that was part of the process of learning to listen, was learning how to make use of the other 3/4 of the time that the brain is moving rapidly, so that we don't miss anything that we're hearing. And also how to hear through accents and a lot of things. It was a very interesting course put out by Xerox many years ago. I'm not even sure if it's available anymore, but I found that I listened a lot differently after I had taken this course than I did before. And of course, they test you along the way. At the beginning, they give you some information, and then after you've heard it, you're supposed to write down what you heard. And of course, most people at the beginning are going to do very poorly because they were missing 75% of what was being presented. And so the course taught you how to tune in and utilize that other 75% to organize what you're hearing and bring it all together in a way that you can go back and remember. And I remember the final test was taking an attorney who was describing a case involving an accident. And at the end of it, then you had, once you listened to this, you had to write down what he really said. Now, the other factor was that he was speaking in a very strong accent on top of it. And so you had to listen through the accent, as well as the fact that he wasn't organized in what he was presenting, so he was going here and here and here and here, and so then you were using your 75% to bring all that together in an organized way so that later you could almost verbatim repeat what he told you. Very good course. If you can ever find it and take it, I think you will be surprised at how poorly you are listening to what you're hearing from people. So, I keep repeating things, and I keep doing what I call tie downs that tie it together so that we ultimately can step back and look at the human body system as one big system made up of smaller systems, and how they all interconnect into this one big process of keeping us alive and being able to move and being able to resist things that could be a problem to our health. Now, what I want to do, and I'm going to do, and not only want, but I am, there's a very good book that it's on biochemistry called Harper's Biochemistry. I probably have a little bit of older edition. I have the 24th edition, which means it's been around a long time. And periodically they go through and revise, add to, edit, whatever it takes to keep it up to date. But I thought it very timely, however, to read a portion of this because I think it fits in very well with what we're talking about. Now, biochemistry, I mean, there's levels of it you can get in that are so complex, you think, how can you remember all these little details? And that's not important at this point. There's some general principles about it I think are very important. Also, this particular book on biochemistry goes quite a bit into glyconutrients, which we've mentioned before, which are special sugars in the body that carry on functions or become a part of your structure or both, and hence they deal with it. And I've looked at a lot of books on biochemistry, and I have several books on biochemistry, and the one I used originally in medical school goes back many, many years, but I don't ever recall from that biochemistry some of the things like the glyconutrients. They were poorly known back then, and a lot of the other things about genetics and all that we've discovered that was not in that book. I think the authors were Kimber, Gray, and Stackpole, if I recall, that wrote the book, and in its day it was considered to be a good basic anatomy and physiology book. Now, you know, of course, the difference is anatomy are the different pieces of your body, and the physiology is how they work. And the biochemistry then goes deeper still down to the cellular and subcellular level as to how all these things go on. They go on every day, every minute of every day, every second of every day. And I think I've mentioned before, and if I did, I'm going to mention it again, that in any given second, every cell in the body is carrying on about 100,000 biochemic steps or more. I mean, we keep discovering more things, and more, even structure-wise, we keep understanding and learning more. And so it's a never-ending job to work to keep up with all this. I work very hard at it, but I'm sure that along the way I miss things unless I'm looking into something or something comes up that causes me to look deeper. And every time I do one of these presentations, I always go back and kind of update myself as to see if there's anything new that's come out. And of course, there's always something. And anyhow, I wanted to read this comment because I think it's very pertinent and fits right in with what we're talking about. Now, they in this book, of course, go through the digestive process, each of the steps, and they also bring things together. And so there's a chapter here called Biochemical and Genetic Bases of Disease. And it's so pertinent to those who are in the health field that they are reiterating what we have thought and believed for a long time. Now, this is chapter 63 of the particular edition that I have, and I was just thinking recently I need to go out and scan to see if there is a new updated edition available. So, this says, Introduction. In chapter 1, it was stated that a knowledge of biochemistry is important for the understanding and maintenance of health, and for the understanding and effective treatment of disease. Put another way, a knowledge of biochemistry offers a rational framework based on the experimental approach as opposed to a received dogma with which to view health and disease. Now, that's a pretty pertinent statement. So he says, this chapter has the following objectives. In other words, there's actually 3 objectives that this chapter has on biochemical and genetic basis of disease. Number 1, to re-emphasize the importance of defining precise biochemical abnormalities that lead to loss of health or to the development of disease, because once these are understood, rational therapy may follow. Wow. I think that's very important. Rational therapy. Now, when I look at this statement in light of the way modern medicine is practiced, this is not done. Now, I'm not saying they don't research, and I'm not saying they don't uncover information, but the treatment has nothing to do much with what we're talking about here. It has to do with management of symptoms. And so it's very easy for them. And another pertinent statement out of here is that the goal is to present biochemical aspects of disease in general and briefly cover genetic diseases in particular. And then it goes on to say, chapter 65 gives complete examples of the value of biochemical knowledge in the clinical setting by presenting 9 case histories, each covering one of the major causes of disease listed in Table 1.1. We're not going to get into all that. But here's this statement that I thought was really powerful. Elucidation of the biochemical basis of health and disease generally leads to rational, again the word rational, treatment of disease. It should be evident from reading this text that the maintenance of health is dependent on an adequate intake of water, calories, vitamins, certain minerals, also fatty acids and amino acids. In other words, they're saying if you're going to have health, you have to take this into consideration, because in order to maintain health, you have to take these things in. Hence, digestion. And he said this illustrates the basic medical principle that it is generally necessary to know the cause and mechanisms involved in generating a disease in order to devise rational and effective treatment for it. Rational and effective treatment. You know, it's interesting to me because that's what people in the natural health field have been doing for years. And he goes on to say Alzheimer's disease, arteriosclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, and schizophrenia are still unknown. Thus, the treatment of such conditions are generally symptomatic and empirical, not based on correcting the underlying abnormality, and generally not very effective. The economic and human costs of such ignorance are immense. Wow. This book says it all. I mean, this is what we're talking about. So, it's important then that we not only understand the digestive process, but that we figure out how we can work with it as opposed to against it. Now, I've emphasized this myself many times, but whether people pick it up, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, just remember that this book was talking about, and what we need to know is that for our digestion to work properly, we have to have the proper nutrients. That means eating foods that are nutrient rich. Now, I told you, going back to the early 1920s, it was realized that nutritional deficiencies were a major problem, creating all these degenerative, what we call diseases. Things like cardiovascular problems, cancer, diabetes, neurological problems, gastrointestinal problems, and behavioral problems. They all were happening more and more and more, and it was almost like an epidemic, and these doctors are saying, why are we suddenly having all this problem? Well, as it ended up, the major issue that those doctors who were able to get people well, who were referred to as modern miracle men, were the doctors who realized the problem of nutrition. Not only in the food, but in the soil that grows the food. If you don't have the nutrients in the soil, they're not going to be in the food. And even though it looks like food and we eat it, we're not getting the nutrition as Harper's biochemistry says. So anyhow, it's not a tough book to read. In some parts of it, you would find that if you're not a health field person, meaning you haven't studied some form of the health field, whether it's nursing, medicine, nutrition, clinical nutrition in particular, and so forth, then you know there's a few parts of it that might be difficult, but in general, I think you can glean enough out of it to get a pretty good picture. The part I just read you was pretty clear cut, didn't require a whole lot of education to understand what he's saying. So, let's just start and take a fast, brief tour through the digestive tract. Now, we know that, of course, the mouth is the first part. Many may not know, however, that the mouth is the first stage of digestion of complex carbohydrates. If you want to illustrate that, take a piece of raw potato and start chewing it up. And as you continue to chew it up, you will notice that suddenly it tastes sweeter. Why is that? Because there is an enzyme present in the saliva. The saliva is important to wet and make more slick and liquid the material so that it's easier to go down the esophagus into the stomach, but it at the same time begins the first stage of carbohydrate digestion. And once that process takes place, the fats were not affected, the proteins were not affected, only the first stage of complex carbohydrate being broken down. So all of that material forms a bolus which goes down through the esophagus all the way down into the stomach. At the end of the esophagus and the beginning of the stomach, there is a valve. It's a sphincter. And when you put food there, that sphincter closes up. And the digestive process of the stomach starts. Okay, now, why is it important for that sphincter to close properly? Because you are going to have some pretty nasty chemicals in that stomach to start the first stage of protein digestion. Okay, so that's what takes place in the stomach. It does not affect the fats, it does not affect the carbohydrates, it affects proteins. The stomach is equipped to break down complex protein molecules into peptide chains of amino acids. That's what it's equipped to do. In order to do that, certain things have to be present. One is it has to have an acid environment. Remember, I've said before that enzymes are sensitive to three things: water, pH, and heat. Those are the three things that are required for enzymes to work properly. The body, if it's working right, maintains the right heat via the temperature, which is 98.6, happens to be the set point, in Fahrenheit, of course. It would be 37 degrees in centigrade. So it has to have that temperature, that water or fluid, and that pH for it to work properly. Okay, so that pepsin requires a very strong acid environment down to the pH of 2. Some say it could go even as low as 1, which is the most acid on the 1 to 14 scale, with 7 being neutral of pH. So you have to have enough heat, so if your body is sub-temperature, it's not going to work as well. If it does not have the proper pH, the amount of acid it should, it's not going to work well. So at best, you can only get a partial breakdown of the complex protein molecules into peptide chains. Now today, of course, we wrestle with all this problem of reflux. And it's interesting because I've mentioned before that the pH has to be extremely acid and the sphincter needs to close off. Now, what happens if you have a low level of acid in the stomach? Hypochlorhydria is referred to technically. If you don't have enough acid, you can't carry out the process properly. So as the acid gets depleted before the digestive process is over, it will allow this sphincter to relax from the esophagus so you could put more food in. Because once that sphincter is closed, if you eat further food, it's going to sit in the esophagus waiting for the stomach process, first step of protein digestion, to take place. Now, if there is not enough acid, and hence it gets depleted very rapidly, guess what? That valve opens, but the stomach is still churning because that valve is controlled by pH. The churning is still going on the stomach. It can push food back up into the esophagus. Okay? The esophagus mucosa is designed by nature to handle food that you put in as long as it's not too extreme acid or not too extreme alkaline. Now remember, I've told you before, well maybe you remember, maybe you don't, maybe that's one of those 3/4 that went by. The lining is prepared for the food, but it's not prepared for even a little stomach acid, or if the stomach were actually alkaline, it would not be prepared to handle that, because it's not supposed to have to handle that if everything is working right. Okay, so if you push some food up in there, even if there's a tiny bit of acid, or even, as I say, if it were to become too alkaline, alkalinity dissolves tissue. I don't know if you knew that or not. Years and years ago, when they were making skeletons, they would clean off everything they could from the skeleton as far as muscle tissue and so forth, and then they would put it in a vat of lye, which is extremely alkaline, and that would dissolve off all the rest of the little remnants of muscle tissue. And I didn't say digest it, it would dissolve it. And hence, you could clean up the skeleton, so you could have skeletons for anatomy classes and for school science classes and so forth. They originally were all made from real human skeletons. And so they would take a derelict body or a body that maybe was donated to science, and that's what they would get the skeleton from. Now, it didn't break down the connective tissue, at least not much if it did, because the bones would still be held together by the ligaments, and hence the skeleton would look like a full skeleton. If it were to have dissolved the connective tissue also, then all the bones would fall apart into individual bones, and you wouldn't be able to have a skeleton. So at any rate, the muscle tissue, which is primarily protein, will break down in high alkalinity. So in either case, you could irritate or even damage the mucosa lining of the esophagus if you had low stomach acid. Now, somewhere along the way, first of all, a lot of people think acid is part of the digestive process in terms of breaking down protein. It is only in creating the right acid environment for the enzyme which actually breaks it down, which is peptase. And therefore, if you're low in acid, you don't break it down well. You may break down some of it until you exhaust the acid, and then it's not going to work anymore. Then the valve's going to relax from the esophagus, and as I say, some of the stuff can be pushed up into the esophagus, which is not supposed to happen until the process is complete and the valve from the stomach going into the small intestine, into the duodenum, opens and allows the material to move out of the stomach into the small intestine. So, everybody says, and when I say everybody, I say a high percentage of people, both in the natural health field as well as the medical field, keep talking about it being too acid. We have too much stomach acid, therefore that's why we're irritating the esophagus from the reflux. Not true. We don't have enough acid. Okay, so if you don't have enough acid, then it does relax, then you irritate the esophagus, and then you don't break down the protein. So I'm hoping you understand that protein has to be broken down, and once it's broken down, the relaxation starts to occur, and then eventually the stomach contents are emptied out. Then the valve relaxes from the esophagus, so you could put more food in. But it does sit in your esophagus, and there's a lot of people that have food sitting in the esophagus so long that it actually is kind of encrusted there. I've just recently heard of somebody that they did surgery because they had all this food in their esophagus. And of course, you can imagine if the food sat there for days, weeks, and months, what would happen to the food? And especially if there's any protein there, guess what? Rot. Rot, then ptomaines. Ptomaines, poison. So I'm hoping you get a better picture. So what does medicine do, regular medicine, if you're having reflux? They call it acid reflux, which is not the case. There could be a small amount, but it's not a major issue. And so they give you a chemical drug that's going to turn off the production of any acid. Used to be the Tagamet and some of those drugs turned off the signal that signals to produce it, and the new proton pump inhibitors inhibit the acid generator from working. They shut it down. Okay, so what happens if you take some of the new proton pump inhibitors? Well, it begins to shut down the acid. In fact, it'll turn it off totally. And therefore, you don't digest your protein. So now it moves out of the stomach eventually, because it will at some point go ahead and dump it out, because there's no acid anymore. When the body message is, okay, we finished digestion, the acid is all exhausted, let's move it on into the small intestine. So now you have these proteins that were not digested, or if you overate, there was a restaurant locally here in Orlando that used to have a 32-ounce prime rib, that if you could eat the whole 32-ounce prime rib, you didn't have to pay for the meal. Now, I don't think very many people collected it, because I sat there one time and watched this big, muscular young man come in, and he ordered the 32-ounce because he was going to eat it all and not have to pay for the meal. Well, I saw him sit there, and as time went on, he slowed down more and more. Never got the whole 32 ounces. I mean, we're talking 2 pounds of just meat. He never did get it all down, and he had to take some with him, and of course he had to pay for his meal. But if you were to get it in, or even in his case as much as he did put in, the stomach is not going to be able to break that all down. And so it's going to move out unbroken down into the small intestine. And as I said, once it goes into the small intestine, then this stomach valve between the stomach and the small intestine closes, and the small intestine begins the final stages of digestive process. First thing that happens is that the carbohydrates now move out of the stomach, which should be an acid environment, into the small intestine, which is now alkaline. So what does this pancreas do? It puts bicarbonate into the small intestine to make a more alkaline environment, because the enzymes that finish the digestion require an alkaline environment and not an acid environment. Now, where does a lot of the acid go that we manufacture? It gets absorbed and utilized by the liver. The liver needs the acid to work right. So the liver gets heavily involved. And as I said earlier about Chinese medicine, the spleen, pancreas, and stomach are a major part of digestion. The liver is the other portion. So there is a liver-spleen harmony in the total digestive process. And why is that? Because the liver has to contribute bile. Okay, so now we have this bolus of food moved out of the stomach into the small intestine, and now the environment shifts from acid to alkaline. And what happens then is that the carbohydrate is then finished by amylase, which is an enzyme produced by the pancreas, and put into the small intestine to finish the carbohydrate, which started in the mouth. The protein that was broken down from large protein molecules into peptide chains now is subjected to some proteases that work in an alkaline environment, but finish the process of breaking those peptides down into the individual amino acids so they can be absorbed into the body. Now, that's not very complex, is it? It's interesting because everything is all geared and programmed to work together if everything is working. But if you interfere with that process, i.e. telling somebody that they have too much acid, that's why they're having reflux, therefore we're going to give you this chemical to turn off the acid production. And then the people say, oh, well, gee, that worked nice, I feel better. And they think they are better. Now, I don't know how many times along the way I've warned everybody, don't depend on symptoms alone to determine whether you are sick or well. You can turn off every symptom almost in the body with some type of a chemical substance that inhibits something, such as the proton pump inhibitor blocks the proton pump, which is bringing the hydrogen ions in to make hydrochloric acid and also the chlorides. And so it stops that. And therefore, you didn't break it down. So now it's going to be in there a while in the small intestine and ultimately the colon, which again, as I say, is warm and dark. And those proteins begin to rot. All those that were not actually broken down are going to start a low-level poisoning of the body. And on top of it, the fact that you've now interfered with that process because they turn it totally off, then you don't have the amino acids. And now why do we need the amino acids? As I said before, to build hormones, enzymes that the body needs to carry on all kinds of operations in the body, and to rebuild the body. All the muscle tissue in your body needs those amino acids to rebuild, and even the brain and the function of the brain requires amino acids. Everything in the body requires amino acids at some point along the way. And if you don't have those present, guess what? Your body gets weak and ultimately sick, and then you're in big trouble. So you can see how illness can begin because two things. Number one, you're deficient in protein, and number two, you are also poisoned because of the fact you couldn't break it down. So it's not nice for Mother Nature. You don't turn off processes, you correct the process. Now, I think I've told you the story before, but I'll mention it again because it's so illustrative of what we're talking about. I had a patient came from another state, and that patient's main problem was heartburn reflux problem. That was a main problem, one of the main. Now, they had other problems that were a result of all this, but that was their problem. So I did my testing, and I told the gentleman, you are deficient in hydrochloric acid. And he became furious. He said, now wait a minute. I have been treated for 20 years for hyperacidity. Now you're telling me that I don't have enough acid. I'm going home. I said, okay, it's your choice. Now, let me ask you this, though, before you go. You said you've been being treated for 20 years for hyperacidity. Are you any better? Well, no. Then I said, maybe there's something wrong in the assumption and the treatment, or it would have been gone. So he looked at me and he said, okay, I'll do the program. So he went home and he called me back 3 days later and said, for the first time in 20 years, I don't have reflux and all this heartburn that I've had all this time. So the fact is, you've got two choices. You can either work against the body or you can work with the body. And so if you can get the body producing the acid it needs to produce, then you've solved the problem. Now, I don't know if that's making sense to you or not, but it's just another example of what happens when you interfere with a process that there's symptoms being produced. If the symptom is because of the problem, then turning off the symptom isn't solving the problem, unless you turn it off by correcting the problem. If you correct the problem, then you don't have the symptom anymore because you've corrected the problem. And whether it's pain or whatever, it's the same issue. If you correct the problem, and that's exactly what this text on biochemistry, Harper's Biochemistry, said, is you have to understand what's going on and you have to work to correct that if you want to have a rationale to treat. Now, if you go to the doctor and you say, well, I'm having all this reflux and heartburn, he says, oh my, you have hyperacidity, you have acid reflux, here are these pills, and you take the pills and you feel better because everything's turned off. And then you say, wow, that's good stuff. All the time that you're taking that pill and turning off the acid, you are making your body sicker and sicker and more deficient of things that it should have, but it can't have because you don't have the acid. Now, I'm being very emphatic because that is a major problem. Okay, so then that means that the protein is finished in the small intestine under an alkaline environment. The carbohydrate is finished, and then you have the fatty acids. Now, interestingly, that's where the liver comes in heavily at this point. The liver produces bile as one of the byproducts of the process that it goes through, getting rid of bilirubin and so forth. It generates this bile, which is capable of emulsifying fats. Fats are large molecules also, and they need to be put in a state whereby the lipases that are also produced by the pancreas can break apart these larger fat molecules so that the liver then can take those constituents and reorganize them into various types of tissues in the body that require fatty acids. And so the liver then has to take the bile and store it so that you have enough of it in the gallbladder that when you eat something that has fats in it, a signal is sent via the feedback to release bile. Okay, so the gallbladder has been storing all this bile, and so when you eat the fat, the message tells the gallbladder liver, we have fats, we need bile. So the contraction of the gallbladder pushes the bile out through the common bile duct, which joins with a structure called the omelette of water, which is like a portion of the duct where the common bile duct joins in with the enzymes coming out of the pancreas and are fed into the small intestine. Okay, so that bile begins to break down or emulsify the fats so that the lipases can break it down into the fatty acids. And hence the fatty acids, as a rule, get absorbed into the lymphatics once they've been broken down, and the amino acids will go into the bloodstream, go to the liver, and so forth, and be done with whatever needs to be done, because the liver does something called transamination and deamination, which means it transforms certain amino acids into other amino acids as the body needs them. And once they're worn out and everything that's manufactured wears out, then they are broken apart and disposed of, and that's called deamination. So you have transamination, deamination has to take place in the liver, so those amino acids that were digested and broken down properly through the two steps, stomach and small intestine, goes into the liver, and the liver, via other feedback messages from the body, produces the types of amino acids that are needed if they're not available. Now, there are a few types of amino acids, somewhere around 8 that people talk about, that are essential amino acids that the body cannot transaminate, can't make from one other type. And so those have to be in the diet. If you don't have them in the diet, you become deficient, and all the structures in the body that require those amino acids cannot work, because you cannot build a protein structure without all the amino acids that are required to build that structure. So if you're missing, you're in trouble. So it's interesting how all of this works together to make you healthy. Now, what's important is the environment in the small intestine, which is approximately 21, 22 feet long. That environment is lined with something called villi and microvilli, which are like folds with little hair-like protrusions that do all this absorbing if it's working right. But there is this mucosal protection, and then there is the immunoglobulin A, which, if there's some things you ingested, that acts as an antibody against that so that it doesn't become a problem. Antibodies lock up things so that they cannot be a problem with your body anymore. Otherwise, the antigens can be damaging to some part of your body, whether it's in the intestinal tract or once it's inside your body, something else. So the small intestine is extremely important. The small intestine also contains, in a healthy person, approximately 7 pounds of good bacteria. Now, can you imagine a 7-pound container full of bacteria? That's what would be in a healthy small intestine. And there's actually more, count-wise, bacterial forms in a healthy small intestine, hopefully they're healthy, than there are cells in the whole body. A lot more. It seems to me it's several times. I'm trying to remember the exact number, but it's several times the number because there's billions and billions of bacterial forms. But it all depends on the environment of the small intestine. And there's a lot of things can upset that, and we don't really have time to get into all of it other than to say one of them could be the ptomaines can upset that environment, and if the environment gets upset enough, it changes the whole milieu of the small intestine, which means the healthy bacteria are either going to die or they're going to be adaptable to the new environment and change their form into a different bacterial form. That's called pleomorphism. I've mentioned that before, and at some point we're going to go into that in a lot more detail. We've alluded to it and talked slightly about it before, but now we've converted these good bacteria into bacterial forms that work differently. Now, part of the problem with that is that the good bacterial forms actually take some of these materials from the digestive process and build certain nutrients and key factors that the body needs, if, again, it's working right. But if somehow you've interfered with this process, that doesn't happen. So then you start more problems. And I'm hoping you see that exactly what he's saying, for all this to take place, this is again Harper's, for all this to take place, you have to have the proper nutrients to begin with, meaning you have to eat food that has the key minerals and amino acids and vitamin factors and so forth. And if you're growing poor food in poor soil, you've got a big problem, because it doesn't have it. So then your body becomes deficient, and every time you're deficient even one factor, a process that normally needs to take place in the body cannot take place. Now, sometimes it could be critical and fatal, or it could be less critical, but over time become more and more of a problem until you go down to some major malfunction, whether of organ or otherwise. Now, these poisons that can be generated in the body can poison you. Again, autointoxication. Now, if you have a poisoned bowel tract and your liver is overburdened trying to take care of all those poisons and can't handle them, and that's not a big or a hard thing to do today because we're exposed to so many toxins in the environment that the liver is trying to get detoxed and get rid of so you don't get poisoned to death with the environmental toxins. And so, therefore, it can't handle all that. So guess what happens? It's going to go in back into lymph, and if the lymph can't handle it, guess where it goes from there? It can be pushed out to the skin. So now you have issues with the skin. Acne and other types, eczema, psoriasis, seborrhea, a lot of these problems is because the liver is unable to handle the toxic load, and it can't stay in the blood because it'll poison you to death, so it gets pushed out into lymph and or out to the surface. I have seen cases where all the skin from the knee down to the foot is purple and all the skin is falling off, and it's weeping lymph fluid constantly, and there's ulcers or abscess spots where the body's trying to push this poison out to the surface. Because we have another problem with gravity, things tend to get pushed downward in the body anyhow. And so those can become a big problem. I'm seeing how our time is going. I don't want this to go into 2 sessions. So I want to finish this as much as we can so that you at least get an idea of what we're dealing with. Okay, so these people were able to get this problem disappear from their legs because even steroids weren't able to turn it off, or antibiotics or anything else, because the body was constantly feeding this poison. And to keep from being poisoned to death, the body has chosen to push it to the surface as the fastest way to get rid of it without poisoning it to death. And so your weeping legs are keeping you from being poisoned to death. But by cleaning up the body, then all of a sudden the legs clear up and heal up, and we've seen that happen more than once. But as I started to say earlier, because of gravity, they get pushed downward, so a lot of that stuff settles in the legs. The circulation, especially return circulation from the legs, can be very poor, especially if people have varicosities. And so then that complicates it even more. And the lymph does not have a pump in your body. It only is activated by movement. And so if you're not doing much movement, exercise, or doing something to move this lymph, then the lymph and ultimately the tissue in the lower legs get poisoned, and it can come out. If it's all over the body, it can be skin anywhere. As I say, bad acne, cysts. I mean, there's all kind of things that are compensatory that the body does to keep you from being poisoned to death. Now, after you finish all this process in the small intestine, and as I say, I don't want to get it so detailed. I want you to get the general picture. Then what's left after whatever's going to be absorbed is absorbed. And now, of course, we have something called a leaky gut problem, where because of the wrong foods and bad foods and so forth, that there's damage to the villi, and you start absorbing some of those poisons directly into the blood because, as I said, the digested materials either go into the portal vein, which goes right to the liver, or they go into the lymph. And so then you begin to get general poisoning of the whole body, and then your energy goes down. You can't make enough energy because the mitochondria are very sensitive to some of these poisons, especially hydrogen sulfide, which is generated in a toxic bowel. Especially if it sits there, it can shut down or impair the function of mitochondria, so then your body can't make energy. So I hope this is all making sense. So when this is all done, this very fluid material moves out of the small intestine into the colon, and it's a little bit slower going through the colon because the water is absorbed out, and there's some other bacterial things happen, and minerals are absorbed out of the colon, and then it's moved out of the body. Now, if people have a constipation problem, which they usually end up having because of all this other stuff not working right, it sits there for a long time and putrefies even more, and now you are really being poisoned by the colon. Because if it's going to get into the water being absorbed into the body, and it's going to carry it into the blood and the lymph, and you again have a big problem. Now, there's certain defense mechanisms that are built in, something like Peyer's patches and other things, to try to deal with a lot of the poisons that come through the gastrointestinal tract, but in overload it can't handle all that. And so then you're poisoned. And people don't know, and even regular medicine doesn't know, the importance of having that bowel working. Ideally, if you eat 3 times a day, your bowel should move 3 times a day. I have people that once every 3 days, once a week, and they think nothing of it. They talk to their doctor, and the doctor says, well, whatever is normal for you. And so they're pretty much ignore that. Now, there was a time, because one of the poisons formed in the toxic bowel, and you hear that a lot from people in the natural health field, is indican, and or endol actually is the chemical. And when it gets back through the liver and is processed, it's converted into indican, which is thrown out in the urine, and there is a test for that. And years ago, medicine used to do the test, but they quit doing it because they had no treatment anyhow. So they just forgot about it. You only treat what you can give a pill for or some drug for, and if you don't have a drug for it, you don't talk about it. That's why they don't talk much about the spleen, because they got 2 options. either leave it alone or cut it out. And apart from that, they don't have any drugs designed to impact spleen function. And so consequently, a lot of people are missing the spleen, and a lot of times when people don't break down their food right and they're producing a lot of poison, the liver gets poisoned, and in the process of being poisoned, it produces poor quality bile, and the poor quality bile gets real sludgy, and it fills the gallbladder up to the point that the gallbladder has trouble squeezing it out because it's so sluggish, and then you get into gallbladder problems. If it continues to sit full of sludge, it will eventually crystallize and form stones, and now you have gallstones, and so what's the medical treatment? You cut out the gallbladder. Now, why is that a big problem? It's a big problem because if you don't have concentrated bile, you can't break down, emulsify the fats so they can be broken down, so you start to become fatty acid deficient. That's one problem. Number two, they're irritating, the bile is, if it's continually trickling down the ducts in the gastric tract because it's not concentrating. Because under normal conditions, when the liver makes the bile, as it goes down the bile duct, it runs into the gallbladder, which is open to receive it, and it's stored up, and then, as I say, every meal you eat fats, it squeezes out some of that bile to break down the fats. So now you're irritating the gastrointestinal tract, and you're not concentrating the bile enough. And as I say, if it's poor quality bile, then it gets thick and sludgy, and then you have the problem with either malfunction or stones. And the irritation to the gastric tract becomes another problem by the constant trickle of the bile. Secondly, if something should happen that it backs up into the pancreas, you can develop pancreatitis, a very bad case of pancreatitis, which could be fatal because of that bile backing up, that bad bile backing up into the pancreas. And under certain conditions, that could happen, especially if your system is shut down because you've got severe constipation and everything's backing up in your system. So I'm hoping you kind of get an idea of how this all works together and how important it is that you keep it all working. And when I get people who have been constipated for years, I know we got a big problem, and we got to go back and do a lot of things, especially get the liver working right, because it's a big player in how well the bowel works. And they, again, they all work together. And if they're not working together, you're in trouble. Now, we don't have time to get into all the nitty-gritty that we could talk about, but I hope I've given you enough information to get you started thinking about it, and get yourself a good book on biochemistry and read through the digestive process. There's some things that we didn't have time to put in, some things the stomach does, some other things that it makes, and some other issues about the gastrointestinal tract. But I hope I've given you at least enough so that you can get started understanding it and be very careful about turning things off. You should be turning things on so they work right. Hopefully this is at least a good enough overview that it will challenge you to learn more. So I see our time is up. In fact, it's passed up as usual. But I didn't want to make it two because it just drags it out too much. And then if you miss one of them, then people get frustrated. So it's very simple if I could keep it all together in one. And so that's what we've done. And I'm hoping that we'll be seeing you again for the next topic. And in the meantime, I want you to be very healthy. And we appreciate you not only coming and watching the videos from mindyourhealthcast.com, but also your comments coming back. Fortunately, about 99.9% of the comments we get are positive. Occasionally, not very many, but occasionally we've gotten some that weren't. A while back we got one that says, is this guy nuts? I don't know what that meant, but anyhow, that was a short, sweet comment, or maybe a sour comment. Anyhow, until the next time, next video, we look forward to talking with you again.